Really great to be here with everybody and to talk up to you about HTA, Health Technology Assessment, and patient involvement. And I'd also like to thank Francesco because he was instrumental in helping us shape the format of what we're going to go through today. And so it was thanks to his input that we came up with this flow and this level of detail, which I hope is useful to you all. So I'm going to start just saying a little bit more about me so you understand who I am and why I'm talking about health technology assessment. So I'm Neil Bertelsen. I'm based in Berlin, in Germany. I've been a patient advocate for a long, long time, since the sort of early, mid-1990s. And during that process, I started to work with many decision makers. And one decision maker that started to be born in the 1990s was this thing called health technology assessment. And I became very concerned that there wasn't a lot of patients involved in that process. So I started working with scientific societies and HTA bodies and many, many other researchers and stakeholders on how we could improve patient involvement in HTA. Alongside that, a lot of my work is about evidence that we bring. As patients and patient groups, we can generate a lot of evidence. But what kind of evidence do we bring? And how do we bring the right evidence to decision makers, such as health technology assessment? So that's another area that I work on. And just like I'm doing today, I do a lot of capacity building, and that's working with different communities across many, many disease areas and across the world, thinking about how we can learn from each other and how I can share the knowledge in my head, but also learn from you as to how things are going and where you see the most need. So that's what I'll be trying to sort of reflect in the presentation going forward. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set the scene. And I'm going to make an assumption here. I'm going to assume that there are people on this call who are new to health technology assessment. So I make no apologies. I'm going to go right back to the beginning and explain why we have it and the basics of how it works before we get into patient involvement. Then I'm going to tell you how patient involvement in health technology assessment works. And we can have a look at different methods that are used and the kinds of questions that we're asked. I'll give you some guidance and tips. So these are things that I've learned over many years, some general rules to keep in mind when you're involved in a health technology assessment process. I'll walk through some case examples just to give you an idea of how this works. These case examples are deliberately not Parkinson's disease. And that's because I want to explain the principles behind the value of our involvement without going into the details of any particular medicine or intervention. And then finally, we have this time, as Francesco said, for questions and discussions. But do stop me along the way if there's a particular question about what I'm presenting. But we're going to start with a question for you all now. I'd like to call up a poll. So Francesco's going to call up a poll. And just want to get a temperature check about how well or not you know HTA. So Francesco will pull up this poll, and it's, do you know anything about HTA? I know nothing. I've heard about it, but I don't know much about it, or you're familiar with HTA. So if you can fill those in, it gives me a sense of how much time to spend on various sections in the presentation. It looks quite steady now. So I think that's telling us that most of you have heard about it, and some of you are quite familiar with it. So, and I think that's a good representative sample. There's nobody on this call who said you don't know anything about HTA, and I might go a bit faster through the very first set of slides if that's the case. Okay, I'll just close that now. So, okay, what is HTA, Health Technology Assessment, and how does it work? So, first of all, where does it sit in the process? So we all know this, how medicines are made. Basic science leads to identifying a potential medicine. Once that medicine has been identified, it's experimented on in clinical studies to see, does it work? And if so, how well does it work? And does it cause any problems that we weren't expecting? And if that all goes well, then it goes for regulatory approval, which here in Europe would be, in the European Union, would be through the European Medicines Agency or the EMA. And then as it hits our countries, it will go through a reimbursement assessment. And that's really to say, should we pay for it within our public healthcare system? And only once all those steps have been taken will it be used within our public healthcare system. And the area we're focusing on the whole of today is this reimbursement assessment. And that's really what I'll be focusing on throughout the rest of the session. So we need to assess medicines for reimbursement because we have a finite health resource. And the healthcare system isn't there just for Parkinson's disease or isn't there just for cancer. It has to meet the needs of the whole population using that healthcare system. And so choices have to be made. But it's important to think how we make those choices. So do we, for example, pay for the medicines for those diseases that have the loudest voices, that get the media attention, that are on the front page of newspapers? Or do we look at the evidence and determine which medicines are bringing value to the patients and value to the health system? And obviously, most of the time in most countries, we try to do the second of those things. But I would say that before HTA, we often did the top thing. It was those disease areas that had most attention that would get most resources. And that brings us to health technology assessment. So just in terms of definitions, so the HTA stands for Health Technology Assessment. And a health technology is anything, such as a medicine, it could be a medical device, it could be a diagnostic test that's designed to impact a person's health status. And so we use this term health technology because we're often talking about more than medicines here. We're talking about a range of technologies that may be used in healthcare. And then the assessment is pretty obvious. It's a process of looking at the evidence and assessing the value of this technology. And ultimately, what HTA is trying to do is trying to determine, looks at the evidence, and it thinks, okay, should we use this technology? I.e., should we pay for this technology and use it within our healthcare system? But that's not all it's looking at. It's trying to say, how best do we use it? For example, do we use this medicine after we've tried all of the other medicines and this is the last medicine on the line? Or do we use it earlier in the process? So how do we use it within the healthcare system? So they're trying to work that out as well from the evidence. Which patients would benefit most from it? Sometimes this is a really important question where they're trying to understand, maybe this medicine isn't for everybody with this particular condition, but there are groups of patients that really have high needs where this medicine would offer great value. So they're trying to answer these kinds of nuances as they assess a medicine. Okay. And the question I often get asked from patient groups is, yeah, but why do we even need this? Because this medicine has already been reviewed by the European Medicines Agency or the regulator. They've already checked to see whether the medicine works and it does things. So why do we need to assess it a second time? And I just want to cover that off first. Well, it's because the regulator and the HTA are asking fundamentally different questions. Okay, so the regulators, such as the European Medicines Agency, they're trying to look at all the evidence and isolate what is this new therapy doing? What benefits does it bring? And what potential harms does it have? So they ask quite a simple question. Does the evidence show that the benefits of this new thing outweigh any potential harms? When you get to HTA, it becomes slightly more complicated. They're always focusing on the difference between the new therapy and what they currently use within their healthcare system. And so they're asking the question, does the evidence show that this new therapy brings additional benefits compared to what we currently have? And are those benefits big enough and important enough to justify the investment? So that's why we have this HTA assessment, which can ask very different questions than the regulators. I just want to walk you through a simple timeline of how HTA works. So a company who makes the medicine, they will submit a dossier of evidence to the health technology assessment body. The health technology assessment body then usually has a technical review team that will look at all the evidence in that submission and start building a list of questions they have. So what questions do we have about the evidence? What questions do we have about the patient population? Those sorts of things. Alongside that, they will start seeking stakeholder input. And in most countries, that includes input from us as the patient community, where we can provide that wider context of where the medicine will fit within the healthcare system, and also the wider context of how, in this case, Parkinson's is impacting us and those that care for us. Most HTA bodies then take all of that input and they take it to a committee. And this committee debates the evidence. They start to ask questions about ethics and society and other issues. And they look at the stakeholder input and they debate what this all means, which leads to the recommendation. This is the official definition of HTA. And I've highlighted here that it's multidisciplinary. So it takes views from various disciplines in order to do its job. And the purpose is to inform decision-making. And why have I highlighted that? Well, it's because there are a few common myths about HTA that I just want to get out of the way. The first one is that HTA bodies decide which medicines are available to us. There are a few that do that, but most don't. Most make recommendations, and it's another committee, usually part of the Ministry of Health, that decides whether they're going to follow that recommendation or not. And I'll show you some examples in a moment where, even though the recommendation is negative, there is a decision to still fund that medicine. The other myth I want to sort of talk about is that determining this access to medicines, people think that HTA is a purely evidence-based technical process. So it's like feeding numbers into a calculator, turning the handle, and out pops the answer. And as I've mentioned already, it's not that simple. HTA discusses the evidence. They balance different parts of evidence against each other, and they make value judgments about what this means. So there are some values coming into their decision-making process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But if we think about the wider health landscape that we all live in, the reality is that it's actually the politicians that make the ultimate decision. It's the politicians in your countries that decide the resources available to healthcare. And this will determine what they can spend on medicines. The politicians will set priorities for healthcare spending. So they might say, we are going to have a rare disease plan and we will put more of our health resources into rare diseases, or we will have a cancer plan and put more resources into cancer, for example. So they set these wider priorities. They also, at the HTA body level, they provide the budget that the HTA has to work with to do its job. So we might be saying, we want the HTA body to have much better patient involvement, but that would require them to have extra staff and office space and processors, and they may not have the money to do that. So again, it's sometimes politicians that we need to speak to in order to improve the system that we have for HTAs. I want to give you a couple of examples now of where we see this mismatch between policy and politicians and HTA. So I'm going to jump over the Atlantic to Canada. So this was a study looking at rare disease treatments in Canada. And Ontario is a province within Canada. So they were specifically looking at, are rare disease treatments available in the province of Ontario in Canada. And so they looked at 155 drugs, rare disease drugs, that are being available in Canada, so they've been approved by the regulator, to see is there a difference between what the HTA decides or recommends and what actually happens. And they found that more than half the drugs that had a negative recommendation, so the HTA body said you should not reimburse these medicines, did actually receive coverage in that province. And what that's telling us is that policy beats HTA. That actually what policymakers do is they can put special funding in place to allow the reimbursement of medicines, even if the HTA body has said recommended no. And we have a very similar example from the UK, which is, you've probably heard about this, the Cancer Drugs Fund. So the situation in the 2010s was that a lot of new cancer medicines were available in other countries in Europe, but were not available in the UK because they had been rejected, not recommended by the Health Technology Assessment Body. And so the government had two choices. They could say, oh, that's really interesting. There's something going wrong with HTA if it will not approve some of these new cancer drugs. So should we fix HTA? Or they could invent a political solution to say, okay, can we come up with another way of funding these drugs and sort of go to the side of HTA? And of course, that's what they did. They went with a political solution called the Cancer Drug Fund to pay for cancer medicines that had not been recommended by the HTA. So again, we see in this example that policy beats HTA. This was a real big win for the cancer community, though I would say at the time, it didn't do anything to help access to medicines outside cancer. So it was very specific to cancer. So to end this section really, when we think about access to treatments, it's also important to think about not just HTA, which I'll talk about for the rest of this presentation, but to also think about that policy landscape. So as a community, we need to understand our landscape, our national landscape, the key decision makers. We need to realize that a negative HTA recommendation doesn't always lead to a negative decision. So we need to be prepared to engage with policymakers on the need for access to medicines. And that means we need to partner a lot. We need to partner with medical societies and other affected communities so we have a strong, united voice when we're making asks to the policy community. And that's the sort of, I'll stop there on the general background and start looking in more detail at patient involvement. So why are we involved and how are we involved? I want to look back at this slide, and the bottom right-hand side of this slide is where I said, actually HTA makes judgment calls. And they do that really in this two-step process. Most HTAs are split into sort of something they call the technical assessment and then something called the appraisal. So the technical assessment, that's where they sort of number crunch all of the evidence that's being provided in the dossier of information that the company has input into the HTA. So they do all the number crunching, they build all the questions. But the next bit is really interesting, which is the appraisal. This is where you have discussions, usually in a committee, where they start to debate what all of this evidence means. And this is where you often have that committee is charged with thinking about ethical, equity, social value judgments. It's also where we see a lot of the input we provide as patients or patient advocates being considered, alongside also the input from doctors that also provide input at this stage. So that's the technical assessment and appraisal step. And I just want to emphasize that it's not this mechanically feeding in information. It's about weighing each piece of evidence and seeking the views from multiple stakeholders to help make the judgment calls about what's important to consider as they make their recommendation. And can you see there's a long question? Okay, I'll look at the question in the Q&A section, but thank you for posting it. So, okay, so I've talked about these two steps. So why specifically do they need us involved? Well, if you think about it from a logical point of view, healthcare systems, they don't want to just pay for things because they're there. They want to pay for things because they provide a meaningful benefit. And by meaningful benefit, something that creates a positive change that matters to patients, that changes people's lives or quality of lives, and that is also, helps the whole healthcare system because people do better because of that new technology. So they're looking for those meaningful investments in healthcare. But they don't know what's meaningful unless they have the patient context. So they need to understand what happens to us. They need to understand our points of view in order to understand what's meaningful. And once they have the patient context, they can use that to focus their deliberations. They focus their discussions on what's most important. And finally, another really important element of this is we are the end user of these technologies. And so there's a question of legitimacy here, that they involve us as well, because it's legitimate to have our point of view as part of their discussions, just as it's legitimate to have the clinician's point of view as part of their discussions. And this is really important because when a treatment is new, there's actually quite a lot of gaps in knowledge. So we may have gaps in knowledge about the clinical evidence. We'll usually have the main clinical trial, the pivotal clinical trial that led to the EMA saying, yes, we think this can be marketed in Europe. But often there's gaps in the data from the clinical trial. These clinical trials only run for a short period of time. So you might have questions about, does this treatment carry on working into the future or does it not? How do we know it's going to carry on working if we invest in this? Clinical trials have quite restricted inclusion and exclusion criteria. So often the people that are studied within a clinical trial are not as representative as the real life people that walk into a clinic. And they often have these questions about what's being measured in a clinical trial. Are the endpoints that have been measured, are they actually the meaningful endpoints that actually lead to a real change in somebody's health? They also have questions about quality of life, and that's often collected through patient-reported outcome tools, those questionnaires we fill in during clinical trials. And there's challenges with these. Some of them are so broad and vague that they don't capture the nuances of what's important to people with Parkinson's, for example. And often there's a lot of missing data within this kind of evidence. So there's questions about how valid it all is. But ultimately, underpinning all that is that the HTAs may not understand the complexities of living with Parkinson's and the impact it has on people's lives, both the person with Parkinson's and those that care for them, around them. And then the final element is that the clinical studies, they don't really capture elements that are beyond that clinical efficacy and safety. They're focused on clinical efficacy and clinical safety. And often a new treatment might have a different way of being taken. It might be dosed differently to other treatments. It might be given in a different way, or it might have other attributes about that treatment that make it different for patients to take compared to what they have today. And so they may be missing other characteristics of treatments that are important to patients, but are not captured in the clinical evidence. And that may mean they overlook the quality of life impacts on the current treatments and the new treatment because they're not thinking about these wider issues. And so we provide the context that helps them do that. So our job is to really point the committee to the key parts of the evidence that have the most impact on our lives and our quality of life, and to bring up issues that are not even captured in the evidence. So we need to give them a lens through which to do the assessment, basically. So we're bringing them that patient lens to say, hey, you need to look at it this way, because when you look at it this way, this is where you see the value. So as they do that, I just want to give you some examples of the kinds of relevant questions that emerge. So they might be discussing the results of the clinical trial. So a key one will be, in all of those outcomes that have been measured, which has the most impact on patients? So they might be discussing how a treatment will change the care that people receive. Maybe a new treatment's going to change how people receive their care. So they need to know what's the current practice of managing this condition from the patient perspective. And what's different with the potential new way. When discussing the value a new treatment may bring, they need to understand, okay, what needs do we still have as patients, as a community, in this case with Parkinson's, what needs do we have that this new treatment may be addressing? They want to understand what's the shape of that hole that's missing and how much of that hole is going to be met by this new treatment. And then want to understand the differences between the new treatment and the existing one. Then they really need to understand in a lot of detail what's wrong with the things that we already have. Why are they not good enough? And we have to be really specific about answering those types of questions. So as patients, we can explain, and patient advocates, I should say, and caregivers, we can explain the impact of conditions that are actually probably not understood that well at the HTA level. We can translate all of that data that's come in, the endpoints that have been measured, the quality of life measures, into what they mean, they specifically mean for us in terms of the impacts we experience every day. We can highlight the way a new treatment is given or other attributes of treatments that can have a positive impact on our lives and our abilities to stay well. And we can be really clear about how our needs are not being met with the current treatments that we have today. I want to give a more, I'm just going to check the chat just for 1 second. Yeah. I want to give a more detailed look at the timeline and the potential for patient involvement, just so you get an idea. Now, what I'm presenting now is an idealized view of a HTA. Some of them have all these steps. Some of them have all of these patient input steps, but not all of them do. So think of this as an ideal that we are aiming for. And it starts at the very beginning. Actually, before the HTA starts properly, we have something called a scoping phase. And that's a look at the disease area, a look at what's currently available, and it determines the scope of the HTA. What kinds of questions are we going to ask? What kinds of issues are we going to probe? And there, in terms of patient input, we see some HTA bodies doing workshops with the patient community in order to get feedback at this very early stage, or they'll do some consultations with patient groups. Some of them do interviews. Then we have the evidence submission phase. This is where the company puts in their dossier of information, but it's also where patient organizations, and in some countries, individual patient experts can write a submission into the HTA. And that submission usually follows a set of standard questions that you answer in writing, and you add your own evidence and points into that. Then there's usually a committee meeting. That's that deliberation step, and they all debate everything, and they want to make a recommendation. So in some HTAs, they do this to make a draft recommendation. And in some HTA bodies, patients can be there at the committee meeting. They attend, they can present, They can answer questions. And we also have people called public members. So these are often patients, but not patients with Parkinson's, if you're looking at a Parkinson's disease drug. These are there really to represent all of the other patients, if you like, or the patient perspective without being disease area experts. And they're often involved in decision making. After you've got your draft recommendation, you have a consultation, and that usually is open to the patient groups that have inputted so far. So it's not usually a completely public consultation that anybody can weigh in on, but it's usually reserved for those that have already input to say, have we captured everything? Did we get everything right? Have we missed something that was important? That leads to a second committee meeting to say, okay, what did we learn at the consultation? You know, what was there anything we missed? Was there anything important that we need to reconsider? And they discuss that and then make their final recommendation. And depending on your country, you may still be able to comment on things that have gone wrong, so factual inaccuracies within that final recommendation. And in some countries, you can appeal that final decision as well. Though that can be quite a long process, I'll warn you. Okay, so how does the patient involvement look? How are we involved? So we looked at this a couple of years ago. HTAI is the scientific society that I do a lot of work with. And we did a project where we interviewed HTA bodies across Europe. And we sort of tried to understand what methods they were using. So some were doing interviews with individual patients. Some were doing interviews with patient groups. Some were doing occasionally workshops where they do workshops to get the input they needed to answer their questions. I heard of one case where they actually were commissioning patient groups to do a piece of research to answer their questions. So they're actually going to a patient group and saying, can you do this research project for us because we need answers to these 5 questions. But the most common way is the stuff on the right-hand side. It's where we give a written submission from patient groups usually, where we answer particular questions, we provide our evidence within that written submission, and we hopefully can also attend that committee meeting. I mentioned that before. So if that's how we are involved, conceptually, what role do we take within HTA? And this is an interesting question that's emerged, I think, especially over the last year. People have been sort of grappling with this. Our role could be at one end of the spectrum, what we call interest holders. It's in our interest to have a new treatment. Okay, because we're patients or patient advocates in this disease area. So what we hold in our hands is this interest, this need for a yes. I need a positive recommendation. And we could focus on being an interest holder. So we go into the HTA almost like it's a campaign. Like you do a social media campaign, or, if you were doing an interview with a newspaper, you'd really emphasize this, yes, we need this now. Or on the other side of that spectrum, you have when we are considered as knowledge holders. So that's where we go into the process with all of this patient knowledge, with the idea that we're bringing this knowledge to help enrich the HTA recommendation, and to make sure that when they're deliberating, when they're thinking through all of these things that they have to balance with each other, that they think through the knowledge that we've brought to them. And what I will tell you, because I speak to a lot of HTA bodies, they really, really admire it when patients come up being knowledge holders. They know we're interest holders. It doesn't mean that they're not mutually exclusive, these two things. You can be both. But when we're there focusing on the knowledge we can bring to help them really understand the issues, that's when they go, we learned so much from that patient input. It really helps us think differently about this. And so it's worth bearing in mind that sometimes, even when we have a massive interest in the final decision being positive, we have to be really thinking about, yeah, but let's make sure that we still bring all of that really rich, deep knowledge. We don't treat this as a campaign, but we treat this as a way of helping the HTA understand why it's in our interest to have a particular new therapy, for example. These are the questions we're asked. We're asked about the impact of the condition. So that in this case, Parkinson's disease, they want to know as much as possible about Parkinson's disease, how it affects people, how it affects quality of life, the impact on caregivers. They want to know about what's their experience of current therapies. Or as much specific detail we can give that's patient relevant at this point is fantastic. But they'll also want to say, okay, has anybody in your patient group, in your country, have you been able to speak to somebody who tried the new shiny medicine? Do you have any feedback on anybody who's tried the new thing? Sometimes we can't answer that question because there is literally nobody that we can speak to that has tried the new medicine. But they also ask us this second question, which is, from what we know, what we've read, what do we expect the new medicine will bring? So what's our opinion about this new medicine based on the knowledge that we have? So they ask us those kinds of questions. And sometimes we have difficulty wondering, thinking about how we answer those questions. And what I would say is there've been some really good guides created that do this. So I'm showing you on the screen here a guide that I really like from Scotland. So the Scottish Medicines Consortium is the HTA body in Scotland. And here you can see they've got one question here. I'm not going to go through this slide, but they give really bullet points, giving advice on the kinds of information they're looking for to answer that question. What I would say is that HTA bodies ask almost the same questions of patients from country to country. So if in your country you do not have a HTA body that produces a guide like this, you can download this one. The questions, I can guarantee the questions will be almost the same from HTA body to HTA body. They're based on a set of questions that were developed about 10, 15 years ago by HTAI, the Scientific Society. So they're very similar from country to country. I wanted to give examples. I don't know if we've got anybody from Parkinson's UK here today, but if we have, I'm going to make a massive apology. So Parkinson's UK, they do really good, detailed input into HTA. And I just wanted to look at a recent one. This was from 2023, so not that long ago. And just pull out some key areas that I could see them covering, answering some of these questions. So what is it like to live with the condition? They had evidence that showed that people have different symptoms. It's about movement, moving freely, people in pain, depression, anxiety, dementia, freezing. So they listed a lot of specific symptoms that people are dealing with. They also focused on care partners and what that means in terms of the caregiver unable to leave the house because they're so concentrated on looking after their partner and the stress that that can cause. They talked about difficulties accessing care and accessing treatment. So difficulties getting appointments being cancelled, limited treatment options for people with advanced Parkinson's. There are some available therapies for advanced Parkinson's, but they can be really difficult to access. So it's not like they're there for everybody. And then in terms of expectations of the new therapy, on the one that I looked at, they used a lot of quotes from patients really to show, what happened with the new therapy, how symptoms improved, how people felt more controlled, how they were able to get more sleep, those sorts of things. And I'm just showing that as a really top level example. And I again apologize to Parkinson's UK because their full submission contained a lot more details than what I'm showing you on this slide. But I wanted to give you a sense of how patient groups approach these questions. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, I'm going to Gives you some brief guidance and tips and walk you through a couple of case studies. And then I think we'll be ready for questions. So some general tips. Okay, I'm just going to walk you through this in a bit more detail. So be prepared, watch out. I'll talk about this in the next slide. Get some early warning for when a HTA might be happening, because often you have a very short period of time to submit to a HTA. So if you know in advance, you have a lot more time to prepare. So watch out for when something is submitted to the European Medicines Agency or your regulator. Know your HTA. I'll talk to you about how you can find out about your HTA in a bit, but you need to know specifically for your country, do they have involvement from patients? If so, what's the timeline? How do you get involved? All of those things. Know the questions they're going to ask. As I said, most of them are very similar, but it's still worth checking them. They might add one or two extra ones that I've not mentioned today. Prepare your evidence. So it's always good to have some form of evidence that substantiates the points you're making. So if you've had this early warning, it gives you much more time to do all these steps. And then obviously take an active part. And I hear from some HTA bodies that they have patient involvement processes, and sometimes nobody submits anything. Literally, it's like, it's just empty. They've put out a call, they've let people know it's happening, and they get no input at all from the patient community. And so we want to make sure that that happens less and less going forward. I'll just step through these one by one. The early warning. So I'm going to make this about the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, but if you're from outside the European Union, just think about your national medicines regulator. So, and we know it takes about a year or a year and a bit from the submission into a regulatory process to the final decision and hopefully an approval. And so when you see that press release, because companies always send out a press release saying, we've just submitted our dossier into the EMA, the clock is ticking now. You know that you've got about a year in order to prepare yourself. But I would say that depending on your country, we still need the company who makes the medicine to submit to your local HTA body. So it first needs to have regulatory approval, and this is what I'm talking about on this slide. But the second step is the company needs to actually put in the information to the HTA to actually really know when the process starts. So that's why it's important to also look on your HTA body's website. They usually have a part of their website where they talk about what's upcoming. They'll have some sort of timeline or some sort of calendar saying, we'll be looking at these things over the next 3 months. Know your HTA. Every HTA has different processes. They have different timelines. They have different ways of involving patients. And I'm sad to say some of them don't involve patients. I'll talk about that in a moment. This is a really useful website. It's a really boring website when you look at it, but it's really useful for you guys because this is the International Association for HTA Bodies, and that QR code will take you to their members list. So that's the list of all the HTA bodies that are part of this international association, which is most HTA bodies. And so you can go through that list and say, if I don't know who does it in my country, you can see if your country is represented on that list. You can find a website to go to and at least find out more. If you can't find your country on a list, go to your government website, your national government website, search for HTA. If that doesn't come up with anything, search for medicine reimbursement or whatever that is in your language. And usually you will find the committee or the agency that does those things in your country. Know what questions you'll be asked. I've mentioned this before, but once you've found that website, you've found that they do patient engagement, they should have some template forms to show you what sort of questions they're going to ask. And hopefully they have guidance as well to help you understand how to answer them. Prepare your evidence. So obviously you need not just to say this is my opinion, but we know that people with Parkinson's disease in our country, they have these particular unmet needs that are not being met by current therapies. What are you going to use as evidence to show that? It could be from patient surveys you've done in the past. It could also be from outside of your country in some cases. If you're talking about the impacts of Parkinson's disease, those impacts are likely to be similar from country to country. So if you don't have the evidence you need yet, start planning, think how you could collect it or how you could find it from others. This whole webinar has been organized by Parkinson's Europe. That's a whole community that you can work with to generate collectively the evidence you might need. General tips: focus on the patient perspective. I always say this, and people always say, we are. That's why we're here. Too often, I see patient groups reproducing the clinical evidence, saying, look, here's all the clinical evidence that shows the value of this new medicine. They get that clinical evidence from the company. They get an assessment of that clinical evidence from the clinicians. The bit that they don't get from anybody else is the patient perspective. So focus as much as you can on the patient perspectives, on the needs that are not being met from that patient perspective. Be specific. I've mentioned this several times. General statements like Parkinson's is a terrible disease to live with, they can't do anything with that. They don't understand what that means. It doesn't tell them enough to help them with decision making. So you need to be really specific. Like that example I showed from Parkinson's UK earlier, where they listed all of the symptoms or a lot of the symptoms that people deal with. You can think through, okay, what does that mean people can do and can't do if they didn't have Parkinson's? So what would that difference be? What is that impact? How specific can you be? Be careful of pure emotion. There's several reasons to be careful. The first is it's not unique to Parkinson's. So the HTA bodies will hear pure emotion from virtually every other disease area that they look at. So it doesn't help to show what's different about Parkinson's or specific about Parkinson's. But it also means that you lose the ability to be specific about emotional impacts caused by the disease that have an impact on people's lives. So you can talk about the emotional burden on people with Parkinson's and those that care for them, but general statements like Parkinson's is one of the most devastating diseases that you can have, they don't know what to do with statements like that. So you have to sort of think through and make sure that you can be emotional. I'm not saying you can't, but be careful of this pure emotion, which doesn't convey any additional information. Focus your evidence. I've said that one already. There may be, in the Parkinson's community, there may be patients that are more in need than others. Maybe subgroups of patients, or it could even be people who live in rural areas compared to people who live in cities, for example. But if there are types of patients who are particularly suffering or in need of new options, then spell them out. Make sure that they're described, because that's the kind of information that HTA bodies really like to know. Oh, there's this group of patients that have got these particular needs, and we need to be careful of those. Look at submissions from other HTA bodies. There's only two places you can go, I'm afraid, I think, at the moment. So NICE in England and CDA in Canada, I think, are the only two HTA bodies that publish the input they had from patients in full. So just like I did, you can go and say, okay, what did the patient group submit 2 years ago to a Parkinson's HTA in the UK? You can go to NICE, you can see exactly what the patient group submitted. It's a way of looking and seeing what evidence did they use. Is that useful to me? Do I think, are there some good arguments in there that I hadn't thought of? It's not about copying. It's just about inspiring each other in terms of what works well. But you may be living in a country that has no patient involvement. So you've got HTA, but they don't involve patients. And so you're locked on the outside. First thing is, I pretend that lock isn't there. So still write them a letter with your key points in. So actually make your submission anyway, but just write it to them. You know, if they ignore it, they ignore it. But at least you've sent something into them, which they may or may not consider. But alongside that, I can guarantee that clinicians will be involved. And you're probably working with those clinicians. So make sure that you're having discussions with those clinicians and they understand the key points you would make if you were allowed to be there, so that they can pass on those key points when they're in that HTA process. And also consider the media. Especially, I say this is especially true where you have no patient involvement process at all. Think about, is there a way for us to talk in the media about why it's important that we have better options, or what's wrong with the way that we are cared for today and the options that are available today? So think through, is it possible to have some more surround sound, if you like, of the patient perspective around the time of the HTA? Really important context here is HTA is such a complicated process with lots of different inputs. You have all of the clinical data, you have economic data, you have so many different inputs. Any one of those could lead to a negative recommendation. And on top of that, we have our patient input. So we may desperately want access to a new therapy, but it's not our responsibility to secure access. And the reason why I think this is really important is I see too often the weight of the whole patient community on somebody's shoulders when they're inputting into HTA. So they're not just walking into that room as a person, they feel like they're walking with the whole expectations of their whole community on their shoulders. Now, they may do the most perfect job possible in terms of the best patient input, answering all the questions really well. But because of something that's outside of their control, it may still lead to a negative recommendation. And that can be devastating. And I really think that we have to protect ourselves here and understand that we are one element in this whole process, and we're not a magic wand. We can't fix everything, but we can make sure that the patient viewpoint is considered and respected within HTA. But we don't have the sole responsibility of securing access. The only people who have the responsibility is the committee who make that final recommendation. That's their responsibility. Okay. Few examples. How am I doing for time? Okay, I'm going to go through these relatively quick. They're not Parkinson's, but I just want to pull out some key learnings that I take from them. So one that I like using a lot is this one from ulcerative colitis. So it's a bowel condition, it's autoimmune condition, but basically the symptoms, the gastrointestinal symptoms, they get so bad that people eventually have to have part of their bowel or colon removed, and then they have to live the rest of their life with a sort of bag on their side, and it changes their quality of life and what they can do. So there was a new treatment that showed that this treatment reduced some of the symptoms, and some people went into complete remission from symptoms, so they stopped having symptoms. But it was unclear how long this treatment would work for. It was assumed that eventually the symptoms would come back, and if they did come back, then they would still need the surgery. So in the long term, people could still have the negative impacts of surgery, and the healthcare system would pay for the surgery, but also pay for this treatment as well. So it was sort of quite a difficult decision. And so the key question became, what is the value of a delay to surgery? And so you had a patient group submission. They highlighted the symptom burden with a focus on the impact of surgery. You had in this HTA, you had some really good patient testimonies from expert patients. So they provided really good written examples of their individual experiences and their individual views. And then when this all came to the committee meeting, the patient stakeholders there, which included the patient expert and the patient group, they really kept emphasizing that for many people, surgery is not an option. And actually, especially for women, it can cause infertility. And so it was, for many people in society, they are not going to do that. They're not going to go for the surgical option. And so what the committee said was they recommended it for reimbursement, but they particularly called out that is this avoiding surgery was important to people with ulcerative colitis. So there was a whole dimension of where the value is that came from this discussion about delaying or avoiding surgery, which wasn't obvious at the beginning of the HTA. The second one is a rare disease, lipid dystrophy. This is where there's distribution of fat in the body, and it changes how the body works, can be life-threatening. So the way this is measured usually is through lab results, laboratory results, blood tests that measure things like levels of blood sugars. And so that's what everyone was debating. How low should the blood sugars go before we know the treatment's working? And the patient community was saying, just hold on a second. That's beside the point. What matters to us is a symptom that we have that destroys our life. And it's this constant hunger that they have. It's a symptom called hyperphagia. But it's like you can't eat enough and you never, ever feel as though you're satisfied. It's almost like a constant starvation. So it destroys people's lives. So the question then becomes, okay, if it's not about blood values, what is the value of reducing this particular symptom for patients? And I have to say, there was nothing in the clinical trials that measured this symptom. So there's no clinical data that actually measured this symptom. But still, it was a debate. And the patient groups, they provided a survey. They showed that a really high proportion, nearly 3/4 of people with this disease suffered from this symptom. They had submission from 2 patient groups really emphasizing the impact of these symptoms. And that was really brought to fore in the committee meeting where they were able to refocus the discussions. And the HTA recommended that the treatment being reimbursed. And they actually called out at the very beginning of the recommendation that is this symptom in particular has a substantial effect on the quality of life of patients, families, and carers. So from the very beginning of their final recommendations, they said, okay, this is a problem, and this treatment can hopefully impact that, and we will recommend that for reimbursement. So I just wanted to give you those 2 examples of how you can really reframe the discussions around value, not because you're bringing evidence that overturns the clinical evidence, but you're helping them see the evidence through different eyes, see it through different ways of balancing the evidence and what it means to you. Last slide now. So these are just my key takeaways. If you do nothing after this webinar, or the next thing you do after this webinar is find out about your system, know your system, find out how you can be involved. Think about patient impacts. Think about Parkinson's disease and how you can bring to life those impacts of patients and caregivers. Think beyond clinical efficacy. The clinical trials will show what clinical efficacy is there, but think about all those other dimensions that are important to patients, important to caregivers. And finally, this is a group of people here, but we have Parkinson's Europe who have organized this. We are a community. You guys are a community that can work together on the evidence you need and the knowledge you need to bring these points successfully into a HTA. And I will stop there, but thank you for listening. I will stop sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks very much for this presentation. I think to start with, we had Not sure if a question, but a comment from Sukad Keshkamat from the Netherlands,
Yeah.
who commented about a specific Parkinson treatment, which is MRI guided focus ultrasound, incisionless surgical treatment, that was very successful for the person in question, but however, is still not reimbursed by medical insurance in the Netherlands, and therefore not fully access to people living with Parkinson's in the country. And as the person previously pointed out, this is unfair and unethical. So we can imagine that this was part of the process why the HTA evaluation for the moment in the country specific evaluated that this treatment should not be reimbursed. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and
Sukhad, for sharing your experience. That's very important
I,
as a personal perspective.
and I can comment on that, Sukad, because one of the challenges we have, you'll have heard me saying drugs and medicines a lot in that presentation. Um, in some countries, we have HTA that only does medicines. And, there'll be lots of other different processes, even down to the single hospital level, about other kinds of interventions that are not medicine. So medical devices, scanners, those sorts of things. So you have this thing called hospital HTA that happens at the very local level, not as formalized as what I've just taken you through. It often doesn't have patient involvement that we always try to say that it should. But you raise a really important point. There are a lot of interventions that are not medicines that are still important that we collect evidence about and that we make the arguments for when there is that evidence. And I'm guessing when I say that you say it's not evidence-based, you say refusing to reimburse, saying that it is experimental, it's not available in the Netherlands because it's not evidence-based. I guess that's always going to be the challenge. It's a really important challenge, is that on one side, we want evidence-based decision making because we know historically evidence-based decision making leads to better quality care and better quality outcomes. But sometimes we may have situations like this where the evidence is not there yet. And we need to understand, is there a way through all that? So I see that challenge. I don't have an answer for that challenge, Sukad, I'm afraid, because it is quite a grey area once we get outside of medicines into how these kinds of interventions and procedures are taken up at the hospital level or at the clinic level. Okay, Wendy, I can see you've got a question as well. Oh, it's yeah. So it's Dutch, English, Spanish, and German magazine. Do you want to say a few more comments about that, Wendy?
Yes. Hi, Neil.
Hey.
Hi. Yes, well, I make it every quarter. It's also I'm also part member of the steering team Visibility and Awareness of Parkinson's Europe. So
Yeah.
they already share it to in their on social media. But well, there's not only from Holland but from all over the world. People are interviewed in my magazine. Um, yeah, what should I say? It's a magazine which is focused on positivity, hope, inspiring each other to let people tell about their lives, what they do in their lives that feels good for them. Um, Next time I will also have a Parkinson's advocate from America in my magazine.
Oh, yeah.
So that shows that my magazine is has a warm welcome in a lot of places on the world. Um, and well, I bring it out in Spanish, and I heard from my colleague who is living in Spanish or in Spain, that the people in Spain is really likes that there is now a magazine in Spanish because they feel now more heard, or they can
Yeah.
read something which they can understand. So I think it's a good way to have in Europe to have 4 languages in my magazine, so we can reach a lot of more people.
I think that's a really good point. And I like what you said in the text as well, that you can get interesting information from this as well, because often HTA, they're looking for those examples. They're really looking to say, okay, but why is that a problem? I don't understand why that's a problem. And if you can make it real to them, then suddenly they go, oh yeah, of course. But they
Yes.
don't automatically get there. It's not their job to know what it's like to live with Parkinson's or to know what it's like to live with any other disease. That's why we can help them. But as you say, this could be a really great resource to see, okay, what are the issues we need to be thinking about? What are those positivity issues? What are those challenges that people have overcome? All of those sorts of things. So, yeah, I think I think we're all sitting on a lot of evidence we don't think of as evidence, is what I'd say as well.
Yeah.
Is we sit on we interview a lot of people, we have a lot of meetings where patients come and they discuss different things, and we might do it for one reason, because we're trying to prepare for a campaign. And so we get some patient groups together, patients together, and we try to understand what we should have the campaign about. But during that, we also gain a lot of other information that's actually really useful information. The other thing is we'll ask for me, if any of you are involved in HTA in the future, can you please share with each other what you submit to HTA? Because it ends up in a black box and we can't find it again. So I told you earlier, the reason my case studies are always from the UK or Canada is because they're the only public place I can go to find out what patients submitted. Just submitting in other countries, I can't see what was submitted. You can't see what was submitted, but that information belongs to you. So once you've submitted it, wait until the HTA is over so you know what the result is. It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative, but then share it amongst the community. This is what we submitted. These are how we answered those questions. So we can all learn from each other what works well, what works less well, what kind of evidence was useful, what kind of evidence wasn't useful. So yeah. So your magazine prompted that to come out of my head, Wendy. So thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. They can also give me questions so that I can see if I can get an answer on that.
Of
That can
course.
be, of course, working together, or maybe we can. I can share my magazine to this the 4 language HTA responsible company in that country. So
Exactly, because
I
go on,
just
sorry,
thinking.
Wendy.
Sorry,
Go on.
what's it?
I said, no, I said, go on, Wendy.
Oh, go on. Yeah, well, it's already in 4 languages. So I think if we can, if I can share my magazine to their HCAs, then they will have already some stories.
Exactly. And equally, if as a community you say, I don't know, as a community you say, there's this one issue that we don't really have any information about. We don't even know if it's an important issue or not. The fact that you're reaching so many people across 4 different languages with this magazine, maybe that's also an opportunity to check, from the readership, is this an issue? If so, what is the issue?
Yeah.
So I really like that idea, Wendy. I think that's a good resource.
Okay, thank you.
Lisa.
Thank you, Neil. It was really interesting. I just wanted to make the comment about sharing because we know I'm in Ireland and we know that there are drugs in other European countries that have been licensed. And I know recently there is one I was involved with that has not been recommended. But surely to know how other countries submitted or what they submitted would only be to benefit them when other countries are then submitting for their individual license.
Exactly. It feels like every country we're starting from square one.
Yeah.
Anybody that follows how medicines launch will know that they're usually launched first in a few places and then other places over the next year and then other places. So it's sort of it's usually a cascade that happens. It depends on the medicine, of course. But that means that quite quickly, we have a lot of case studies of what was submitted. If you're involved in a HTA, so you're actually sat in that room, you will hear what the questions are. You will hear what the objections are. They may not all be public, but you'll get a good sense of they weren't convinced by the economic model that might come up, or they weren't convinced by the efficacy improvement wasn't big enough to convince them there was a big enough. You will hear whatever those concerns were. Now, from country to country, some countries may be less concerned about that thing and more concerned by another. That's up to each country. But as a community, you'll start developing a lot of insight into what are those critical HTA questions that are not answered by the evidence that's submitted. What did the patient group provide? Out of what the patient group provided, what was taken on board? What made them listen? What didn't work so well? And together we can learn this. So yeah, Lisa, we should be. The one request I get constantly, I've been doing this for 15 years now in this kind of format, is can we have a repository, an online repository that holds patient submission inputs? Yeah. We've tried a million times to get something like that off the ground. It doesn't work because of various rules, conflicts of interest, copyright, whatever. But as a single patient community, so when you think about Parkinson's and you think about a region like Europe, I don't see any reason why there's a problem after the fact, after HTA has been published, of sharing amongst yourselves, this is what we heard, this is what was submitted.
Yeah. And it's prompted me to go back actually to that person to see where it is and what it's at and what was the outcome.
Yeah,
I forgot about that, yeah.
Yeah. Just having a look. Okay, so Sukad, what communities do I can share my legal fight with the system? There is an organization, well, one you're here with Parkinson's Europe, so they can maybe answer that question in terms of a Parkinson's group. In terms of another organization, I can't remember their name. They're originally based in Italy, but they have a Brussels office. They're called something like Citizen di Nava or something. They are specialists in citizens' rights and patients' rights. They do a lot of work in Brussels, but they're originally an Italian organization. And I can't remember how to spell their name. Sukhan, I'm sorry. I know it's really difficult to spell and pronounce. But if you search for patient rights, citizens' rights, Francesco has put it straight into the chat. Thank you for saving me there, Francesco. So,
and Sukad, I also reply to your questions directly in the chat. I suggest connecting to the Dutch Parkinson Association if you're not yet connected with them, because they're very active in the Netherlands. And because you brought up an issue that's very specific to the country, probably they might be able to at least to share it with the rest of the community. And probably there will be other people who might be in a similar situation as yourself in the Netherlands. So
thank you so much, Francesco. Actually, I am a member of the Scientific Advisory Council of Parkinson's Netherlands.
Oh, you are there. Okay, great. Okay, great.
And despite that, I find it difficult to prove the evidence-based research, the evidence behind the evidence-based question, so to speak. So yeah, I have access to it, and yeah, it doesn't help particularly. So I was just thinking if there is any forum, international forum, where I can share information about how I'm fighting the system. I have a legal insurance subscription, so I'm happy to fight the system. So I would actually, it's not for my own interest. It's not for trying to get money out of the system for my treatment, but to help others who are fighting the system as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, off the top of my head, Sukad, I would think also non-disease specific organizations such as the European Patients Forum, which operate at European level to advocate for the rights of all patients, again, might be interested in your story, because working across different disease areas, no doubt there will be cases similar to yours with specific surgical treatment or specific treatment that have been rejected by HTA and therefore are not available in certain countries, which creates obviously disparity of access among countries, which we see it a lot in Parkinson's, and no doubt we would see it across other disease areas. So it might be worth even that. Thank you.
And lastly, we have a comment from Alan from Parkinson's UK. So Alan, yeah, great that you're involved and you're already working in terms of assessing grants for the charity. And yeah, they're doing great work in terms of collecting evidence to put into HTA. So yeah, you can always go to the NICE website, look at Parkinson's, and you'll see that usually if it's got anything to do with Parkinson's, there will have been a submission by Parkinson's UK. So you get to see what they've actually submitted. Are there any more questions? I don't think so. Francesco, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you all for being with us today. I hope you found the discussion useful and engaging, and I would say a huge thanks to Neil as for being such a clear and engaging speaker and being able to translate, which is no doubt a complex subject in very easy to understand terms, which hopefully are gonna help the audience and the representative of Parkinson organizations that we have had the pleasure of having with us today. In terms of next steps, this is part of a process. So we do not really wish for this webinar to be a one-off. So as I was anticipating before, first of all, it's being recorded and we're gonna publish it soon on our YouTube channel, Parkinson Europe, for this to be, because it's been so informative, for this to be available as an information resource for other people to watch in their own time. But second, we are planning to follow this up with a specific workshop or focus group on the intricacies, I would say, of navigating HTA, which will be again held and coordinated by Neil, our speakers, and it will take place we plan for this to take place in the early autumn. As such, we would invite you to let us know if you might be interested in taking part in such an initiative. Obviously, being a focused group or workshop as opposed to a webinar like we are today, we will have limited places. But so if you are interested in participating, please email the email address that I'm gonna put in the chat right now.
And I'll just add to that while Francesco is doing that.
Yeah.
The idea about the workshop is, there's a lot of information, some of it general information that I shared today. I think the workshop is really about, what does that mean? What do we actually do? What evidence is missing? What do we still need? Those sorts of practical questions are sort of where we'd like to go in the workshop. We don't have all the answers. And the point of the workshop is working out what we can do together, what we need to do individually, all of those sorts of things. So contact Francesco and let him know if you're interested. And we will see how many people put themselves forward and take things from there.
Yeah, and I will also follow up with a general recap email to all the attendees of today, just to outline next steps and let you know once the webinar is up for to be watched on YouTube. And I encourage you, if you know other individuals or organizations who you think might find this interesting and useful, please share it once it's live.
Yep.
So thank you again, everybody, for attending. Thank you very much, Neil, for being such a great speaker. I personally really very much enjoyed this, and I hope everybody else did. And yes, we will see some of you in the early autumn for the next part of this work. Thank you all again.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon.